You don't need the room to like you. You'll walk into a party where you know nobody, grab a drink, find a corner, and be completely fine. Not performing confidence, not white-knuckling through social anxiety, actually fine. And if someone asks you later how it went, you'll probably say, "It was good," and mean it without needing to debrief for 45 minutes about whether people thought you were interesting. People sometimes read this as coldness, or aloofness, or that particular brand of too cool detachment that gets annoying fast. It's none of those things. It has a specific psychological origin, and once you understand it, you'll recognize it everywhere, in people born between 1981 and 1986. Here's what the psychology actually says about why you are exactly the way you are. Start with the thing that makes this cohort genuinely unusual. You are old enough to remember being unreachable, not unreachable as a wellness practice. Not, "I'm doing a digital detox this weekend," unreachable. Actually, structurally, nobody can get to me, unreachable. You left the house and you were gone. Your mom didn't know exactly where you were. Your friends couldn't text you to see if you were coming. You existed for hours at a time in a world where the only people who knew what you were doing were the people physically standing next to you. And nothing bad happened. You figured it out. You came home. You did it again the next day. That experience of existing fully without documentation, without an audience, without the low hum of being potentially observed, is something no generation born after roughly 1990 has ever had. And what it did to your psychology is more significant than it sounds. Here's the contrast that makes this clear. Think about someone born in 1995. By the time they were 12, they had a Facebook profile. By 14, Instagram was shaping how they understood what a good weekend looked like. Their adolescence, the years when identity actually forms, when you're figuring out who you are and what you value, and how you want to move through the world, happened in public, with an audience, with a metric attached to it. That's not a criticism. It's just a fact about the environment they developed inside. Now think about your adolescence. Before the computer arrived in your house, and it arrived late, maybe 1995, maybe 1997, with that dial-up screech that took 30 seconds to connect and knocked out the phone line while it did, you had already spent years becoming a person, in private, with no record of it. You knew your best friend's home number by memory because that was the only way to reach them. You recorded songs off the radio onto cassette tapes and held completely still when a car drove past in case the engine noise ruined the recording. You had an entire interior life that nobody had ever seen, rated, or responded to. When the internet arrived, you didn't grow up inside it. You walked into it as someone who already existed. That is the psychological distinction that shapes everything that follows. Psychologists call this identity autonomy, the degree to which your foundational sense of self formed independently of external validation. Research on adolescent development consistently shows that the conditions under which identity forms during the key years between 11 and 17 have lasting effects on psychological architecture well into adulthood. People whose identities formed under conditions of public feedback, likes, comments, follower counts, the constant social monitoring that platforms are specifically engineered to produce, tend to develop self-concepts that are more externally anchored. Not weaker, necessarily, just more dependent on the outside world as a reference point. People whose identities formed before that feedback loop existed developed something different. A more internally anchored self-concept. A baseline sense of who they are that doesn't require the room to confirm it. This is where that ease you feel in uncomfortable social situations actually comes from. It's not a personality trait you were born with. It's a psychological structure that formed because you spent your most formative years without an audience, and you learned, without ever consciously learning it, that you were fine either way. Now let's talk about something you probably don't frame as a skill, but absolutely is. You can sit with uncertainty without it eating you alive. You can hold an open question about a relationship, a career decision, something unresolved at work, and not need to resolve it by Tuesday. You can tolerate ambiguity in a way that genuinely bewilders some of the people around you, particularly the ones who are a few years younger and seem to need everything sorted and confirmed and made sense of immediately. This is not emotional avoidance. It's the opposite. It comes from having grown up in a moment of genuine historical instability and having watched the adults around you navigate it in real time. If you grew up in the US, you came of age watching institutions that were supposed to be permanent, companies, careers, entire industries, restructure or disappear. If you grew up in Australia, you watched the economy that your parents had built their assumptions around shift underneath them. In both cases, the adults in your life were visibly adapting, improvising, rebuilding the plane while flying it. And you were watching. Psychologists call this transitional socialization, developing during a period of systemic change, where the lesson absorbed isn't a specific set of rules, but a meta-skill. Rules can change, systems can fail, and you can still figure it out. It's uncomfortable to grow up inside. It's extraordinarily useful in adulthood. The economic dimension of this cohort's psychology is equally specific, and researchers have been tracking it for years. Elder millennials entered the workforce between roughly 2003 and 2008, which means some graduated into the tail end of the post-dot-com hangover, and others graduated directly into the 2008 global financial crisis, the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression, at the exact moment they were supposed to be building the foundation of their adult lives. First job, first savings, first sense that adulthood was actually going to look like something. Instead, what many got was entry-level jobs that disappeared, graduate salaries that stagnated, student debt that didn't, and a housing market that, by the time it theoretically recovered, had already priced them out of the cities where the jobs were. Economists Hannes Schwant and Till von Wachter, analyzing decades of labor market data, found that workers who entered during a recession experienced earnings deficits that persisted for more than a decade after the broader economy recovered. Not a temporary setback, a permanent recalibration of trajectory. But here's what that economic hardship produced psychologically, and this part is less discussed. When the system fails you at the moment you're supposed to be trusting it most, you stop outsourcing your sense of security to the system. Not bitterly, just practically. You build redundancy into your plans. You develop a pretty finely tuned radar for the difference between an institution that's stable and one that's performing stability. You get comfortable making things work with less than you were told you'd need. Psychologists call this functional resilience. It's not the inspirational poster version of resilience. It's the specific kind that comes from having had your assumptions tested early and having survived that. There's a term worth knowing here: dual fluency. Dual fluency, in psychological research on adaptability, refers to the capacity to operate with genuine competency inside two fundamentally different systems. Not surface familiarity. Not, I understand how both work. Actually being at home in both. Elder millennials are the last generation that is genuinely, experientially fluent in a pre-internet world, not as nostalgia, but as lived operational knowledge, and among the first to have adopted digital life deeply enough to be fluent there too. You know what it costs to be constantly reachable because you remember what it felt like not to be. You understand the attention economy not as the water you swim in, but as something you watched being built from the outside, and then chose how much of yourself to bring into. Research on cognitive flexibility, particularly work by psychologist Ellen Bialystok at York University, studying people with deep experience navigating between two distinct systems, consistently shows elevated performance on tasks requiring attention switching, managing conflicting information, and adapting when the rules change without warning. You are a bisystemic generation. You didn't just learn one world, you learned two completely from the inside. And that dual competency produces a brain that is harder to destabilize, more comfortable holding contradiction, and less dependent on the environment being predictable. One more thing, and this one sounds almost too simple. You know how to be bored. You can sit in a waiting room without your phone and not feel like you're going to crawl out of your skin. You can take a walk without a podcast. You can have a thought that nobody else will ever see and be perfectly comfortable with that. This is not a trivial thing. Neuroscientists studying what's called the default mode network, the brain state that activates during genuine unoccupied time, have found that this is the state where the most cognitively valuable processes happen. Memory consolidation, self-referential thinking, the integration of disparate experiences into coherent meaning, creative insight, emotional processing. A generation that grew up with constant stimulation from early childhood has less practiced access to this state, not because anything is wrong with them, but because they never had to build the tolerance for the discomfort that precedes it. You built that tolerance every summer, every bus ride, every afternoon, when there was genuinely nothing to do but figure something out. What felt like dead time was, neurologically speaking, practice. Here's the thing about being born on the seam between two worlds. For a long time, it can feel like a gap, like you're supposed to have a clean generational story, a defining crisis, a recognizable aesthetic, a set of traits that travel ahead of you and explain you to strangers, and somehow you ended up in the space between two of them. But the people who have lived in two fundamentally different systems don't just understand both sides. They understand both sides from the inside. They know what both worlds actually feel like to exist in, not theoretically, not nostalgically, not with the distortion that comes from only ever having known one. Research by social psychologist Roy Baumeister on self-concept stability found that people with independently formed self-esteem, meaning a sense of self that developed prior to and separate from public social feedback, show significantly higher resistance to social comparison, external criticism, and identity-level threat. You are not resistant to these things because you're indifferent to them. You're resistant because you have a reference point that was formed before anyone was watching. And that reference point does not require the outside world to confirm it in order to hold. You didn't get the clean generational label. The chart puts you somewhere, but the description was never really about you. What you got instead was something rarer. You got fluency in a world that no longer exists, and competency in one that barely existed when you were born. You got an identity that formed in private before it ever had to perform in public. You got the specific kind of resilience that only comes from having had your foundational assumptions tested early and having built something solid anyway. That quiet steadiness people sometimes misread as distance, it was never distance. It was just someone who already knew who they were before anyone thought to ask. If this finally gave language to something you felt for a long time, subscribe. There are a lot more videos here about the psychology behind why generations are the way they are. And if this one landed, you'll want to watch this next.